Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of our Trainz route building tutorial series. In this series I'm using TRS 19, but most things also apply to other Trainz versions. In this episode I'm covering terrain textures. So let's begin by loading our route. To access terrain textures, click on the Paint tab on the right hand side, which is the second from the top. Here you can see a list of all textures that are currently installed in Trainz. As you can see, there are quite a few. To narrow this list down, you could use the search filters by clicking on Display menu, Show Search Filter, and then search for something here, but this is not necessary, as in the Paint tab there's already a search box in the top of the tab. So if you click in here and then type something in, for example, grass, you can see it now only displays textures that have grass in the title. Now in this case there are still quite a few textures here, so for this example I'm just going to choose one at random. For example, this one. Now, if you move the mouse pointer over the terrain, you can see that there is a brush following the pointer. If you click and hold, you can see that you can paint textures onto the terrain. Now, if we zoom in, you can notice two things. One, the texture doesn't have a very high resolution, and two, there is quite an obvious repeating pattern if you look down the texture. To help with the first issue, you can change the scale dial to change what scale the texture is being painted at. So if I reduce this all the way down and then paint, you can see the texture is now much smaller. To contrast this, I'm going to turn the scale all the way up, and you can see just how big this effect is. Now, although making the texture smaller has helped with the resolution, as it's now being displayed at a smaller scale, but it has made the repeating texture problem worse. To help with these patterns, you can do two things. One is you can change the direction of the texture. To do this, you can either use the compass here to change the texture's orientation or direction. So if I set it here, for example, then you can see that if I paint here again, the orientation has changed. Now you can also do this by pressing and holding the square bracket keys on your keyboard. If you hold either of these keys down, you can see that the compass continuously changes direction. Now, if while holding this down I draw, you can see that the texture also continuously changes direction. As you can see, the texture is no longer repeating as much, but it is also quite a bit blurrier. The second thing you can do against repeating textures is just to pick a different texture. Now in this case, this texture worked quite well with the changing orientation method. I like to call the twirling method, but some other textures won't. For example, if I select this texture and try the same method, I'm holding down the left bracket key, you can see that it doesn't help very much. Now, as with the terrain brush in the topology tab, you also have a radius dial here which changes the size of the brush. Let's undo this. To the left of the radius dial is the Get Texture tool. If you select this and then click on a texture you've painted on the terrain, you can see that it's now selected the other texture again. If you want to fill a certain area on the terrain with a texture, you can select the Select Area tool, shortcut B, then select an area, and then click the Fill Area tool. As you can see, this area has now been filled with the texture that was selected. This is also affected by the direction and scale selected. So if I choose a different direction and a different scale and then press Fill Area again, you can see that it's changed. To cancel a selection that's on the terrain, click the Cancel Selection button. Now, if you want the entire baseboard to be one texture, for example a grass texture, then you can select the texture you want. For this example I'm going to choose this one, and then click on Fill Grid below the scale dial. By doing this, you've opened a Bulk Asset Update/Replace window. What you can do here is put the assets you wish to replace on the left. In this case, the grid is in here, which is the default grid pattern you can see on the baseboard, and then put the asset you wish to replace the other assets with here. If you click here, there is a drop-down where you can select either Anywhere on Route What this option does is it replaces the assets, which are in the list above, anywhere on the route. If you select in current section only, it only replaces the assets on the baseboard that the compass or camera pivot is currently on. If you select in selected area only, then you get the select area tool, and you can select an area on the terrain in which to update the assets. Now, if I click the begin button in the lower right corner of the window, the grid should be replaced with the grass texture within the selected area. Now let's change in selected area to anywhere on route and click begin again. Now the grid texture asset has been replaced anywhere on the route. Now let's say that we want to change the other grass textures we have here to the new texture. To do this, we can simply select the Get Asset from the World tool and then left click on the texture we want to replace, and as you can see, it's been added to the list of assets to update. Now if I click begin, that texture has also been replaced. Let's close this window. And that covers all the terrain texture tools. I would like to give you some small tips though. The first one is that if you have a large grassy area like this, then only having one texture can look a bit boring. So what I usually do is I select a different grass texture. So for example, let's select Meadow Grass 2, and I'll change the radius down a bit. And then I'll do the twirling method again, only this time I'm going to move the mouse very quickly so that the other texture shines through better. Now, as I'm sure you'll agree, this area of grass looks much more interesting than this area of grass. But if the texture you've chosen doesn't really fit that well, you can just replace that texture with one that fits better. To do this, select the Fill Grid tool and then click and drag the texture asset that you want to replace over into the left list of assets. Then choose a texture you want to replace it with. So for example, let's just try this one, Seasonal Grass 2. Now, if you left click and drag this over into the Asset to Replace With slot, you can see the little image has updated. And now if you click begin with in current selection selected or anywhere on route depending on what you like, you can see that this texture has now been updated. But as it turns out, the new texture and the one that's below it are very similar, so let's try it again. So I'll try this texture instead, Seasonal Grass 01. I'll just undo the previous step and then drag this texture over into the Asset to Replace With slot and then click begin. And as you can see, this one stands out a lot better, but there is the problem of the pattern again, even though we used the twirling method. Well, this is because there is a check mark in the Replace Ground Texture Rotation and Scale option. So if I undo this action again, and then remove the check mark, and then hit begin, you can see that the rotation has now been kept. Now with this particular texture, the pattern is still quite obvious, so you would just need to find a different texture. The second tip I have is to have a darker grass texture that you paint underneath shrubbery or hedges or forests. So I just make a little area of forest. The Objects tab will be covered in a later video. Now that we have a small area of forest, you can see this already looks pretty good. But if you look down, it looks a bit strange that the grass that grows out in the open is the same grass that grows underneath the trees. It would look much better if it were a bit darker. So let's find a darker grass texture. One that I like to use is Pbr Grass 6. So let's now draw this underneath the forest. I'm going to increase the radius a little and then start drawing. Now if we look at it from the side, you can see that this already looks much more like an actual forest. The third tip is that textures stretch along the vertical axes. To demonstrate this, let me quickly add a hill. So if we now look at the texture on the side of this hill, you can see that the texture is quite stretched. The fourth and final tip I have is to draw ballast underneath your tracks. So let's add some track. Now that we have some track, let's just zoom in, and you can see that this already looks quite good, but the edge between the grass and the track is very sharp. Usually, if the track is well maintained, and you can clearly see that this track is quite well maintained from the fact that there is no grass growing on the ballast, then ballast will usually also be a bit to either side. So let's find a ballast texture to draw underneath this. Now that I've found a texture that fits quite well, I'm going to put the radius all the way down, and I'm going to draw underneath the track. Now, if you hold left click and then hold right click, you can see that I'm drawing as I'm moving the camera along. This is quite helpful when you're drawing underneath tracks. Now let's see how it looks. As you can see, there is quite a large gap here where there was no gravel painted at all. Well, this is because the textures can only be painted on the grid of the terrain. So this baseboard is at the moment using the 10-meter grid size, which means that each point that the texture can be painted on is 10 meters apart. So if we change this to 5 meter by going to the Topology tab, selecting the 5-meter grid size from the drop-down, selecting the Add or Update Ground tool, and then clicking on the top of our baseboard, clicking Yes, you can see that, well, for one, our textures now look like they have much harder right angle edges. This is because the textures were previously smoothed out on a 10 by 10 meter grid size, so the smoothing area was also 10 meters. Now it's been changed to 5 meters, and so the smoothing now aligns to the 5-meter grid. But this is only the case for textures we've drawn using the 10-meter grid size. If I now go to Textures and get this texture and draw here, you can see that if I draw new textures on it, they don't have this hard right angle edge to them. So now if I go back to the ballast texture we've been using before and try to paint it underneath again holding left click and then holding right click, you can see that the texture is now following the track with much greater detail and it looks much smoother. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful.